We're going to get started with the webinar here, and today's speaker is Claudio Vera. Claudio is a certified accessibility professional with over 20 years experience in UX design and front-end development, and after a successful career as a creative director and founder of 2 web design firms, Claudio became an advocate and evangelist for digital accessibility and inclusion. Claudio is a public speaker on the subjects of usability and accessibility and has created workshops to develop more empathy and understanding in the UX community. Claudio currently works with Royal Caribbean Cruises and handling digital accessibility and compliance for the company's many web properties. We're delighted to have Claudio with us as today's presenter, and thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to turn things over to Claudio.
Good morning. Give me just 1 second. I'm going to make myself the presenter so you folks can see what I have on my screen. And we had a little bit of a hiccup this morning with fonts, so I'm going to be presenting off my laptop, but that also unfortunately means that I'm not going to be able to see your chat. So if you do have a burning question, just be a little bit patient because I'm going to have to rely on Kevin and Rachel to be able to relay those questions to me. So this morning we're going to be talking about building a business case for accessibility, and particularly in a corporate environment. And like Rachel said in the introduction, I had a career for about 25 years as a web designer, as a UX designer. I was also working with front-end themes since I owned my own web design firm. I also saw things from a management perspective. So all of these in the corporate environment that I'm in today really helped me out because they put me in a position where I don't just have empathy for persons with disabilities. It also puts me in a position where I have empathy for the teams that are building web content or any sort of digital experiences. I'm in my 50s. So I'm at an age now where I'm also starting to see changes in my own body, changes in my vision, and so it's easier to take a more broad or more humane perspective in terms of folks with disabilities and how they use software and how they navigate through digital content. I have my mother, God bless her, who's 91, going on 92 years old. And she has Parkinson's, and she's starting to also see a lot of the sort of physical limitations happening in her body. So she's been a real inspiration for me as I've made the transition from straight UX design and web development into accessibility. I work with Royal Caribbean, and Royal Caribbean is the world's largest cruise company. It's headquartered in Miami, where I'm speaking from today. And a couple facts about us. We're 6 companies. We have 3 major brands that we manage in-house. That would be Royal Caribbean, that would be Celebrity Cruises, and Azamara Club Cruises. You could argue that we are or we're not the world's largest cruise company. We are running neck and neck with Carnival. And so it really depends on whether or not you're looking at the number of guests every year that we have, or the number of ships that we have. We have 59 ships. We have 17 of them on order that are in the process of being built. We've got 65,000 employees, of which only 10,000 work shoreside. So that kind of also comes with its strange sort of circumstances, because of the employees that work on our ships, all of them need to pass certain physical requirements, certain physical exams in order to be certified, to be fit to be working on a ship, and that's per maritime law. So in terms of the work that I do day to day at Royal Caribbean, I work not just on websites, but on a variety of digital content. So the 2 darker frames on the left, which are public websites, and the hiring portals, those are definitely, they work on the web, and they also have the benefit that I can work with automated testing techniques to examine them and test them. As far as mobile and native apps go, you can only do a very limited amount of automated testing. So we need to have manual testing. I need to be able to work with folks on the QA teams to be able to manage and review their own work through techniques where they're working with Android Studio or they're working with Xcode. But the same is true for augmented reality, and the same is true for kiosks and gaming stations. So I'm in the position that I have right now. I'm working well beyond web-based digital content and starting to look at apps and other sort of applications and platforms that go beyond just sitting down at a computer. And they start having certain sort of digital requirements and accessibility requirements of their own. Now, in my company, I show this slide a lot of times when I do presentations. The slide on the left comes from stock photography. The slide on the right comes from our own marketing. And so the notion that a lot of folks in my company have is kind of an outdated notion that persons with disabilities are a little bit helpless and waiting for someone to very kindly push them along or help them in what they need to do. So fundamental to my making any sort of business case with regards to accessibility is for me to be able to get people to connect with the fact that persons with disabilities want to be independent. They don't want to wait around at the bottom of the stairs to be able to be helped up. They don't want to be able to wait for assistance every single time. So this is a fundamental icebreaker that I use a lot of times when I'm talking to management or different teams inside my company. So who are we serving? Well, we're dealing with independent people with different physical abilities. A lot of times I ask the sort of folks when I'm doing empathy workshops, I'll ask them what they would do if they had some sort of event that would suddenly limit their abilities. And a lot of times it's like, well, would you basically go home and hide away, or would you actually want to continue to be, and the word I use is badass, the same badass that you are every single day? So if you were to come back from that sort of event, would you be able to continue to be the same badass that you are today? And that puts people in a position where they start realizing, like, okay, I need to be able to use tools in a different way, and those tools need to work for me and work for the sort of physical limitations that I have. And so then they start realizing, okay, what's holding them back? It's that they can't, that the tools need to be worked slightly differently. You need to work with Microsoft Office differently. You may need to use a screen reader. But the key issue is that you're going to find yourself that the world was designed for somebody who is able-bodied, and you're going to be finding limitations over and over again in a world that is not designed for you. And this image I use a lot of times as well when I make my business case. It's like, the architects here had one job, which was to be able to build a ramp, and they didn't quite do it. And some people, it takes them a little bit of time to actually get that, oh, wow, if I were using a wheelchair, I would not be able to go up these stairs. And most able-bodied people would walk by this ramp without giving it a second thought. So a lot of what I do in the empathy workshops is getting people to see things from a different perspective so that they don't look at accessibility advocates as these sort of shrill activists that are there and being a nuisance. It's more like, okay, how do we enable these persons with disabilities, these badasses, to continue with their badassery in their everyday life? So I also start talking about it in a different context in terms of, for me, in the 25 years that I was a web developer, this would be really easy, like to say, like, okay, we've built and we've shipped an entire app, we've built or we've shipped an entire site, the budget's been cut, we had our sprints, we've been focusing our resources on everything, we've been focusing on minimum viable product, and then you just kind of say, well, yeah, we never got around to that accessibility stuff. And it is kind of a dirty secret in the industry. And when you're talking to PMs and you're talking to developers, they get this. This is a way to connect with them. Well, unfortunately, not including people in your product and not including people in how you built your website is discrimination. And this is why the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, came about, was to prevent this sort of accidental discrimination or discrimination by omission, or however you want to put it. Most of us think of discrimination as something that you actively do through conscious bias or conscious racism. And so I use this sort of message to get people to understand that discrimination isn't necessarily something in a corporate environment that you do consciously, that it is often, especially in the digital world, it's a sin of omission. Another struggle that I have within my company is being able to understand how far you want to go with your efforts towards accessibility. So my company prides itself very much on innovation. It is one of the core values of the firm. And what I have a hard time portraying with a lot of teams sometimes, or one of my challenges, is getting people to go beyond the minimum of ADA compliance, or getting people to go beyond trying to get a certain score with WCAG. If I go back a couple slides, we're talking about this ramp. A lot of folks will look at the sort of scores that you get with accessibility testing tools, and they'll look at the scores and say, well, I've got a 75% score. That would be a passing grade, right? This slide or this image is what I use to show people this is what 75% accessibility looks like. So sometimes you need to go beyond, and sometimes only 100% or close to it is good enough from a digital point of view. I also try to get people to think of accessibility as something, it's not a quick fix. It is not something that needs to be done immediately. It's a distance race. It's not a sprint. And it's something that you need to plan for long term. So in other words, disability inclusion is a journey. And for us in the company that I work with, at Royal Caribbean, we're a service-based industry, and it really starts showing in terms of the sort of interaction that people have. And I've been very fortunate to work with this company, which is very inclusive, it's very diverse, all of the same sort of human attributes that you would have in terms of how you address and you work with your guests, the sort of courtesy, the kindness, the politeness. It also translates into how people interact with each other in a day-to-day work environment. So I'm fortunate in that sense that I'm not working in a company where those human values aren't core and where there is resistance or sort of apathy to the feelings of others. So I'm fortunate in the sense that kindness really is a go-to here at Royal Caribbean. So this journey that I can describe, there's a few other ways of approaching this. Like for instance, Level Access has a digital accessibility maturity model which addresses this. And most of these stages that I'm going to be talking about, these have been described by Glenda Sims and Wilco Fears in a white paper about accessibility wars. And so I have a link to that on my last resource slide. So I will be posting this deck up on my personal slide share. So if you download this, you should be able to link to the white paper later on. So what are the stages that a company goes through in its journey towards disability inclusion? Well, first of all, most companies start off where they're just simply not compliant. And that is probably the status quo of most large organizations right now. So what do you run into? Well, you run into some parts of your customer experience, in our case, our guest experience or our digital experience or our employee experience that cannot be used by persons with certain disabilities. And that lack of accessibility is a source of legal exposure. So because of that, you can't necessarily talk openly about what your efforts are and what you're doing with regards to accessibility. And it actually gets a problem because you can't talk about your successes sometimes or your wins sometimes with accessibility because you're going to draw attention to yourself and somebody's going to see these trouble spots in addition to that. So this becomes a problem. The next stage is where you're minimally compliant. So in between these two stages, we have to imagine there's a barrier of what you would have to define as your minimum of accessibility. And even just defining that in a corporate environment is challenging. So the definition that we use with the access department here is that there are critical tasks that you need to perform with your digital experience. So if you are, for instance, on our booking site, that you're able to make a reservation, arrange for payment, enter in your personal information, all of those are critical tasks that you need to be able to perform. So the definition of minimal accessibility is that everybody can perform those minimal tasks regardless of their physical ability. So there is that sort of barrier between not compliant and minimally compliant. So how do you find minimally compliant? Well, you're just meeting the standards. One of the things that is the outcome of just barely meeting standards is that, well, you're not going to have a terrific guest experience. So just being minimally compliant is going to affect your guests with disabilities and their families. And in that group, the likelihood of them recommending Royal Caribbean to others really goes down. And that likelihood of promoting Royal to others is defined as a Net Promoter Score, and it is probably one of the most important metrics that we have in our organization. The other thing I can say that's true of organizations that are minimally compliant is that accessibility is really an afterthought. So it's not something that you're bringing in at the beginning of the process. It's kind of, oh, well, we're at the end. We've got a ship that's just about built. We've got an app that's just about done. Hey, can you check that if it's accessible? And if it's not, could you sprinkle some accessibility dust on it? So those are challenges that I've seen in a number of organizations in terms of managing accessibility in the early stages. In the white paper that Glenda Sims and Wilco Fears wrote, they defined this stage as optimized. So in this case, it really is where your company is competent at handling accessibility. So you've got a user experience that it doesn't really stink for folks with disabilities or their families. And you've been starting to work accessibility standards earlier into design and construction. So it's starting to become a consideration before you launch. And so therefore the cost of remediation or the cost of making fixes goes down quite a bit. The ideal stage is this competitive stage where accessibility now becomes a competitive advantage. Where in our case, for instance, we would have given so much attention to guests with disabilities that it's part of the culture that we present, it's part of the sort of messages and the imagery that we have in our marketing materials, that we've innovated with that in mind, that we've given folks with disabilities the same attention as everyone else, or more so, and that accessibility or inclusion, better yet, is part of the process where we're doing customer journey mapping, when we're doing design thinking, and that we're setting up personas for our concepts that include several personas with disabilities. So we've kind of talked a little bit about how the timing affects the cost. So if you're talking about, for instance, the web development process, And this you could almost literally swap out for the construction process. So where you're going from concept to wireframes to design to implementation, as you move through these stages, the cost, which is your vertical axis on this graph, it jumps up in a step every single time you pass one of these landmarks. So the cost of being inclusive at the concept stage is minimal. The cost of being inclusive when you get into wireframes is a little bit more, but it's certainly less than the cost of being inclusive when you're in design. When you start getting into implementation and up to staging, the cost gets even higher to do fixes or remediation. So ideally, you want to be able to catch your issues, or you want to be able to address your issues around accessibility. You want to be inclusive earlier on in the process. And what I'm presenting here in this graph is really the ideal scenario, where ideally you've caught almost all of your accessibility issues before you go into staging. The real world looks a little bit more like this, where if you get called in later in the process, after your site is in staging, when it's in QA, or worse still, you decide to launch a product and then you start reviewing it for accessibility after it's in production, when it's live, that's when your cost of remediation is absolutely at its highest. And so I'll present this to management, particularly directors, VPs, that sort of middle management tier. And I'll say, well, the business school that I went to, the difference in cost between being proactive and not being proactive, we had a word for it. And that word is waste. So getting folks to understand that if you can handle your issues before you go into implementation, or in implementation before you go into staging, rather, if you can handle your issues earlier on in the process, it costs one thing. To not address them then is so much more expensive, and it's just basically a waste of resources. There's been a lot of talk in the developer community about shifting left. So this is kind of the same thing. The bottom axis is the time axis. And as you go through the project life cycle, you pass all of these different milestones. So the typical quality model, and here the vertical axis is the attention given to quality. So it's not a money figure, it's just an attention sort of variable. That it peaks when you're in testing, which makes perfect sense. In the shift left model, you're testing as you go, you're reviewing your designs for accessibility before you pass them on to your developers. Your developers are testing their code before they commit it to a repository. So the whole idea with shifting left is that you're giving attention to quality earlier in the process, and if you do so, then you're going to be reducing the costs. So, Kevin, why don't we do this? Can we break for any questions right now? Does anybody have any questions? I can't see anything on the screen.
We absolutely can. We don't have any questions in the chat at the moment, but please go ahead and put your questions in the chat. Those of you who are connected over the phone, this is a reminder that you can unmute yourself. You can press pound or hash button 6 to unmute your line. We will be able to see that you've done that, and we'll give you a chance to speak. So please do that now. And I do see some questions typing, so I will turn that over to Rachel to make sure that they get read aloud for everyone.
Okay, the first question we have in is coming from Joshua, and he asks, for the chart with increasing costs, what do you do when people push back and ask for actual numbers?
I fortunately haven't been asked for actual numbers, but I don't think for anybody who's managing teams for a product manager, I don't think there's a necessity to prove to them that making fixes earlier on in the process is less costly and less difficult and less painful as well than making changes later on in the process. So I've been part of that process myself before I joined Royal Caribbean in terms of making fixes to something that is already live. The process you have to go through to go back into testing, go through staging, bring that into production to basically do a new release of your product or a new release of your site is so much more painful than being able to just make a fix earlier on in testing. The version control efforts that you have to do when it's later on are just so much greater. So
Okay,
do you have
thank
another
you for
question?
that. Oh yes, another one came in from Susan, and she's asking, this is great, so thanks for the part about describing stages of disability inclusion. Can you repeat or restate what you suggested about barriers between non-compliance and minimal compliance?
So the barrier, it's not a barrier, it's more of where do you draw the line? And I've run into this as well with some of our teams where, where I'll have directors that are pushing back. It's like, we've got all of our resources committed. We don't want to commit any more resources than we have to. So where do you draw that binary pass-fail line when it comes to accessibility? And the way we defined accessibility is being able to perform critical tasks regardless of your physical ability. So if I find a critical task like you can't sign up for offers, or a critical task like you can't change your reservation because there's some sort of blocker from an accessibility point of view, then I would consider that non-compliant. And it's been a challenge for us to move away from looking at a numerical score with an automated testing tool like SiteImprove or AMP. It's taken some work to get us to move away from that sort of mathematical or score-based sort of approach to something that's a little bit more qualitative. The other thing is having that sort of definition of like, can you perform critical tasks? It translates really well into mobile and other digital platforms because you're doing manual testing. And for instance, if I'm manually testing an app, I can't tell if there's 12 other instances of an error that I run into right off the bat. So for me, having a pass-fail sort of scoring system and having it work around being able to perform critical tasks, that allows me to, yes, to assign pass-fail and also to rank the sort of issues in terms of their criticality, in terms of their severity. And that translates very well into working with developers in a QA environment. I hope I answered the question there.
Okay, it looks like we have one more question come in from Enrique. Asked, have you ever tried integrating accessibility requirements on design systems? In parentheses, where it applies.
Enrique, you're definitely onto something. And in design systems, yes, and your typical sort of accessibility requirements that you're going to have to deal with are, you're going to have to deal with focus, like how do you show focus, particularly when you're testing with keyboards. Color contrast is a big one, although from a criticality point of view, it's not as critical as handling focus well. You have to teach people, for instance, where to put messages in their error system. And so it's an ideal situation, and it's what happens when you've been brought in earlier in the process and when the folks who are doing design are thinking proactively. So it is absolutely a goal to strive for. And the other thing is, if you work your accessibility into your visual design system, then you're not going to have to be making corrections every single time an inaccessible master template or master design has been implemented. So it's an excellent approach, and it's one that I would recommend in any organization.
Okay, Enrique said thank you for validating, and I don't see anybody else typing at this point. So thank you for those great questions, and we'll continue.
Okay. So we'll also have a chance to ask questions again towards the end. So one of the things that I found is that the conversation for accessibility is very different with different stakeholders that you have in your organization. And upper management thinks of accessibility very differently from middle management. And so you frame the conversation differently. So first of all, when you're making an ask, you don't want to ask for just what you need to be compliant. You want to be visionary. So you want to go beyond what your essential needs are. In an organization that's as large as Royal Caribbean, your chances to interact with upper management are very few and very far between. And you need to be incredibly well prepared for those interactions. And you can't go into a presentation to upper management and, for instance, not know what your company's sales numbers are. Or, in my case, not know the breakdown of the number of guests in every single one of our brands. And so, although that sort of information may seem a little sort of peripheral to, the accessibility cause that you're promoting, you really need to be extremely well versed in that sort of information so that you can't be caught with your pants down in a conversation with management. The most important thing that I would say if you do get your audience with upper management is to be very strategic. And how you tell the story and how you present accessibility really is more about company values and the brand pillars. So when I first came on board with Royal Caribbean, they put us through a new employee orientation. Well, the new employee orientation was laying out all the company values and laying out all the brand pillars. Now, most of us would be like high schoolers in a really boring class and we're going, okay, this is just management BS, we don't need to pay attention. For me, I saw that as like, this is the actual language that management is using to be able to describe what they value and what they feel is important in the company. So essentially, if this were an exam, they would be giving you the answers to the questions. So if you can, I would say, if you have any sort of employee materials, anything that talks to company values, study that before you make your presentation regarding accessibility, because you want to be able to couch that in those same sort of values and same things that they hold dear. So this may seem really counterintuitive, but you kind of don't lead with your dollar arguments. Your dollar arguments might be supporting facts that you have at the end. So it's not a money conversation that you're going to be having most likely with upper management. Instead, you should be talking, if you use any metrics, use net promoter score that we talked about earlier, customer satisfaction, any other sort of metrics regarding your workforce or efficiency. And again, you've got to be very, very well prepared to have that conversation. So what about middle management? So middle management in our company would be directors of interactive or directors of different interactive projects, brand directors, and they generally go into it. You're probably, if you're an accessibility professional, you're not going to be invited to the planning table where they're setting up the budgets and the timelines. And that's just until you get to a point where your company's in the ideal stage, you're not going to be invited to the table. So these folks are dealing with their sprint schedules, their timelines, their resources, and it's tempting to say, well, we've got 65 critical issues on the website. We need to address those immediately. Well, that's the most disruptive way to handle it as far as the timelines are concerned, and it is sure to earn you the permanent hatred of pretty much everyone that you need to work with long term. I'm very fortunate in the sense that we have 2-week sprints, and we're on this sort of continuous improvement or continuous integration cycle. So we're constantly releasing new patches or new features or new ways of handling content in all 3 of our brands. So that kind of puts me in a position where I can be a little bit more laid back about it and be, okay, if it doesn't make it into this sprint, it makes its way into the next sprint. And how do we communicate? Well, the key thing is, in this case, it's being tactical. It's how do I merge with the QA processes, and how do we get our issues into the issues that I find, for instance, when I'm doing manual audits, how do those issues go into their issue tracking systems and their bug tracking systems? And so a lot of times you'll have to learn Jira, you'll have to learn how they assign projects in Jira, you'll have to know how to inject yourself into that process, or you're going to have to develop something in parallel, like for instance, handing off spreadsheets of issues to your middle management. But the most important thing is you don't preach. And when working with QA teams or working with middle management, we already value a better guest experience. We already value inclusion in our company. It's really more a matter of, most of the teams that I'm working with, their attitude is just give me lists of what to correct. So preaching is probably less of a good skill than being able to write a really good report or a really good bug report and knowing exactly where to put it in an issue queue. So with clients, dealing with promoting accessibility within your organization, or if you're a vendor, for instance, a website developer, and you've got clients, these are the sort of excuses that you're going to run into all the time, or the sort of barriers you're going to run into. Budget is always one, because unless you are remarkably forward-thinking as an organization or remarkably mature in that sort of life cycle that we showed, there's not going to be a budget for accessibility. Or even with the best of intentions, they'll think, well, that's going to be something nice to have and something that we address at the end of the project if we have budget left over. So that's always going to be an issue for pushback. Not having enough resources. Accessibility in an organization rarely has a high position on the org chart, and getting resources or getting manpower I think outside of higher ed, it's a real challenge to find that. People tell you, well, there's no time to do it. So if you don't have a continuous improvement schedule, then trying to squeeze it in a particular time frame gets that much more challenging. And then we have people, you know how you have people years and you have dog years? Well, then you have corporate years. And things move far more slowly in a corporation than they do in a smaller organization. And I came from managing my own web design firms and working with independent small teams. And so dealing with a different time frame in corporate America and Royal Caribbean has been a real challenge for me. If someone asked me in an interview what was the worst challenge I could possibly find towards accessibility, and I would say absolutely positively, it's people that don't care. And even if you've made the arguments for accessibility, they don't care. Those are pretty big obstacles, and your best bet is to work around them. And I am blessed that I almost can't think of any in my organization of 65,000 who are that way. But I have certainly dealt with that before in the client world. If you work in an organization that doesn't value accessibility and inclusion, and it's not even close to the company values, well, if you're an accessibility professional, I would almost say pack up your bags and find a job somewhere else where your efforts and your your passion can be put to much better use. There's a couple soft skills that I've had to learn as well, which is learning to nag politely. So if you send someone 6 or 7 emails asking for the same thing, keep your cool. And making meetings happen with managers who aren't responsive. And you have to always assume that if someone's not responding to you, it's not because they're blowing you off, it's because they're distracted or busy with someone else. So there are tricks like CCing their manager or setting up a meeting with their manager instead that can make a meeting or unblock you if you're particularly stuck. So if you're a small accessibility organization or accessibility unit inside a large organization, you're going to need to find ways of working with people long term. And so here are 3 suggestions that I have for ways that you can work organizationally beyond just your accessibility department or your access team or just yourself. So first is having a steering committee. And the steering committee you'll include top management, and you're thinking in terms of setting strategic goals. Your steering committee are going to be the ones that say, we need to be X% accessible by the end of 2020. Or setting these sort of lofty targets or setting these lofty initiatives or validating that inclusion is one of your brand pillars. So that comes from the top of your organization. Your working groups, this is where you're dealing with product managers, your brand managers, your owners, the middle tier of management that is responsible for deliverables. And your working groups are going to have a lot of insight in terms of how you integrate with the rest of the organization, and they're going to set the tone for how you work with teams. And then you can create task forces to deal with individual accessibility issues or challenges, or to build a design system, for instance, Enrique. So task forces are extremely useful for dealing with documentation or setting up a good workflow. So all 3 of these, you're working with different levels of talent, and it's the best approach for making a business case organizationally for accessibility is a combination of working top down and working grassroots. And if you're able to find the sort of pivot points in your organization at those different levels and work those well, then you're able to have much larger impact in your organization without burning yourself out or without feeling like you're hitting stone walls. So legal is a part of an organization most people fear, but because accessibility with major brands in the United States is driven by lawsuits, it's unfortunate, legal can be your ally. So legal can be really the driver in an organization that pushes for compliance or can create a sense of urgency if management or middle management is not creating that sense of urgency. So legal is a great team to have in your back pocket. And yes, you can include them in the steering committees and the working groups that I mentioned before, but really it's a unique relationship that you should nurture as much as you possibly can. So what is it about lawsuits? I'm going to go into explaining a couple of these in detail and how they work. But first of all, no one wants to go to trial, and no company wants to go to trial, and no company wants to be that guinea pig defendant. So if there were, for instance, Vera v. Royal Caribbean would not want to have its name on that landmark lawsuit. It's terrible for your brand. So every corporation will do what it can to settle before it goes to trial. Now, settlements are less costly than litigation, but they also add up. And having one settlement, for instance, in January of 2019 doesn't prevent a lawsuit from happening in February of 2019 where you have to pay out another settlement for the same exact flaws. So they do add up that way, and that continued exposure gets very, very costly. I think it's hard to put a dollar figure on that because it's not just one lawsuit that you're trying to prevent. You're trying to basically prevent a steady stream of them. So legal can definitely help you in creating that sense of urgency. If we were brought to court and then we have a settlement or there's some sort of agreement and we fail to live up to the terms of that settlement, if there were to be a second lawsuit, then it would be very difficult to defend our position in front of a judge. So that continued lack of compliance completely will undermine your ability to stand up in court and seem like a good actor. And it's very difficult, particularly if you're managing large organizations with tens of thousands of web pages. How do you keep them all squeaky clean? Part of the issue with nobody wanting to be the guinea pig is that in the United States, we don't have a standard for what's acceptable, what is an acceptable amount of non-compliance. If, for instance, we have 100,000 web pages and we're missing alternative text, is it okay to have 5,000 instances of missing alternative text, as awful as it sounds? Is 10,000 okay? Is 50,000 okay? So there is no clear guideline in terms of percentage or quantitatively what seems like an acceptable standard, and there hasn't been a case yet that's happened where a standard like that has been drawn up in any jurisdiction. We also mentioned the damage to a brand that can happen. So certainly you do not want to be seen as the inaccessible brand, and one lawsuit can undo years of building confidence in your brand. So every single lawsuit that happens around accessibility, if there's, with very few exceptions, if there is a settlement, that settlement is going to be confidential. And so you have very rare cases and very rare instances where you can actually see and look into a lawsuit. And in this case, Mendez versus Apple, this is a lawsuit that was filed in August, and the Guardian UK took the legal document for the lawsuit and posted it online. So it's one of the very few that you can take a look at and start dissecting. And I have a link to the lawsuit, again, in the resources to this, if you feel like you want to go through and dissect it. So in this case, Mendez v. Apple was filed by a law firm in Brooklyn, and it was literally a copy and paste lawsuit where they filed the same lawsuit against, I think, like 60 or 80 defendants. So how did they do it? Well, first of all, you need to establish legal standing. So the law firm files a suit, but you need to have a plaintiff, and the plaintiff almost always is a blind plaintiff because living up to working with screen readers is particularly challenging for web. Next thing that you're going to do when you file is you're going to claim that Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to you. So this means that your website is being treated as a physical accommodation. So in our case, we're a cruise ship company, so we need to provide physical accommodations like you would in a hotel, a restaurant, or movie theater, according to the ADA. We also need to apply those same sort of accommodations that don't discriminate, don't create unequal access for our websites. The legal aspect as well, a lot of cases are filed in the state of New York, and these are human rights cases or class action cases as well, which increases the sort of damages and changes the way that the case is handled. What you want to prove if you're if you're filing one of these cases, is that you have unequal access. So a lot of times they'll show that there are offers that are on a website that someone with a disability can't see. So, for instance, if I were offering a 50% discount to New York State residents and we have a banner on our website and that banner is missing a piece of alternative text, and that text that is the offer is actually an image, then we would be committing discrimination because someone who is using a screen reader would not be able to see the content of that offer. So therefore, that creates a pricing differential between a sighted and a non-sighted person. So that is discrimination. Same if you can't access a promotion, or you can't make a purchase online, but then you have to call an 800 number. So anything that could potentially hint to a difference in pricing or a difference in how you do business, that is the best way of making a discrimination case. And so missing alternative text, missing form field labels, these are like the two top cardinal sins for accessibility that we run into. Those are also the easiest ones to spot with automated testing software, so those are used as evidence. In Mendez v. Apple, they searched and replaced the plaintiff's name and address. So there were other large brands that were fed the same exact lawsuit, except with different names and addresses. So even the numbering system of all the different points was the same. In this case, they listed, if you go to the Guardian document, they listed 17 potential accessibility issues. You read a little bit further, and you realize that of the 17 that they listed, only 4 were the actual complaint against Apple. So literally, it was a checklist of potential accessibility issues, and in which really the ones that applied were checked off. A scan was run using a desktop automated scanning software as evidence, and the way the sort of damages that were asked for in the case, they were asked for monetary damages for the plaintiff. Those are usually small. Those are usually under $10,000. The lawsuit will also include legal and expert fees, and those can run in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then if there is a penalty being asked for violations, it could be as much as $100 to $500 per violation. The only thing is we haven't seen in the United States a standard of what constitutes a violation. So if Apple has a 100,000 page website and it has 10,000 missing instances of alternative text, does that create a potential liability of Apple of $10 million for those instances of missing alternative text? So it's easy to see how these sort of costs escalate. So this is building up to this slide, which is really where you need to start breaking down what are the costs of a lawsuit. So you pay your monetary settlement, it's fairly small. And beyond your settlement, you're going to need to agree to do other certain things within your organization. Well, you're going to need to fix your accessibility issues, and you're going to have a particular time frame to handle that. And most typically, it's somewhere between 180 days and a year. But if you don't have that already built into your costs and you're going to have to do special development, then the cost of fixing those accessibility issues could be in the millions. If your website or your apps are utterly and completely inaccessible and you have to throw them out, then you've got to talk about doing you need to talk about replacing your publishing platform entirely, and you need to do that in an accelerated time frame, and so the costs of that also go up. You'll need to hire accessibility experts, a third party, because you yourself don't necessarily have that expertise in-house to be accessible. And that there you're talking about 6 figures a year. You're going to need to train your web and your mobile staff, and that's 5 or 6 figures depending on how large your internal staff is. And you're going to need to publish an accessibility policy. These costs don't include, for instance, the cost of hiring an outside legal defense counsel. And if you're a hospital or something, you need to create alternative formats, for instance, for filling out medical forms, that sort of thing. And so those costs are also not in here. But these are basically the main categories of expenses that you will have if you're faced with a lawsuit. If you have to get really detailed, Peter Shickley of Access to Online has put out a spreadsheet that breaks this down even further. So this is a portion of the spreadsheet, and it goes by year, but it basically puts the costs into different categories. And things like legal advice, or producing an accessibility report, or working with an accessibility company. This is, if you have the ability of determining all these different costs, this is a good way of doing a cost-benefit analysis. So this is the cost, and this next slide really gets into the benefits. And the benefits are basically, they're all risk mitigation. So the benefit is, what is the cost of the litigation that didn't happen? And for me, that's a very hypothetical number, and it's one that's difficult to determine. But if you have the ability to get these figures, then this spreadsheet that Peter Shickley has is a really good tool for being able to quantify that. There's on the right, you see there's in the rightmost column, it says confidence factor, and there's 85 and 80% of that. Personally, I would probably assign something to like 30 to 35% of any sort of figures that I would be fed internally in my organization. But it kind of works in the same way that you would be calculating a sales pipeline. You take a dollar figure and you multiply it by the confidence factor. So that gives you basically a weighted percentage based on probability. So what are other numbers that you could use if you're trying to make an argument? So on my wish list is percentage of revenues from persons with disabilities. And this is a two-edged sword, because if you're an organization that's very early on in the life cycle, then you could find that your persons with disabilities who are in your customer base, or for us, for instance, who are our guests on our ships, that number is actually surprisingly low. And that if you were to see what the percentage is of the population at large, that the percentage that you have in revenues from persons with disabilities is lower. You could also look at, for instance, in my company, we use average per diem spending as a real metric. And if you were to do that for persons with disabilities, you might find a difference in terms of the fact that persons with disabilities spend more for every day that they're on one of our cruise ships. So this gives you an idea of what sort of metrics you may want to find to try to make your argument. The one metric you cannot find is the percentage of web traffic from users with disabilities. And that percentage is basically, browsers do not report whether the user agent is one that's used with a screen reader or not. So you will not be able to determine that. But on the other hand, you do have the ability of determining, of being able to find what is the percentage of the population that has a disability. And the latest figures just came out in November of 2018, but they were collected in 2014, and there's an Americans with Disabilities report that's on census.gov. Also, I have a link to that on the last resource screen as well. So what is the takeaway that you should take from my presentation today was certainly that different appeals work, and they'll work differently with different personality types and different levels of management. So you want to basically have a lot of different arguments in your arsenal. If you're a company where kindness is a real corporate value, empathy, um, inclusion, then making an empathy argument, making a moral appeal, saying this is the right thing to do, has more weight than you imagine, particularly with upper management. So they're thinking in terms of what is the company we want to be. And so if you can couch accessibility in terms of corporate responsibility or align it with something else, for instance, like safety, then those are arguments that work very well with one level of management. We looked at risk mitigation, particularly on the legal side. There are other arguments that you can make in terms of efficiency and why it's more efficient, for instance, to handle accessibility proactively than reactively. We looked at the spreadsheet in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. And there may also be ways in which you can make a case for accessibility being useful from a competitive advantage point of view. So this slide here has links to different articles that we mentioned. I forgot to mention the list of accessibility settlements that are on Lainey Feingold's website. She has a different way of handling lawsuits where you handle them through structured negotiation. So it's a collaborative process with where both parties work together interactively towards coming up with a settlement. So those settlements are not protected with confidentiality clauses. They're all listed there on her website, and they're very, very useful legal resource. And so I'd like to open it up to any sort of questions that you folks may have.
Okay, looks like we do have someone typing. Okay, it came through from Christine. My management is supportive of digital accessibility, but I want to convince them that it is a full-time position and or even a team might be needed. Do you have any suggestions?
I would say the best way to make an argument is, it really depends on the circumstances. The best way is a cost-benefit sort of analysis. And, applying for a team is far more challenging than applying for one full-time expert. So you may have to back down from, you ask for a team and you settle on having yourself being full-time. So be prepared to negotiate along those lines. But I'd have to know a little bit more about your organization to really understand exactly which arguments would be best.
Okay, looks like Christine is adding to her question. In the meantime, as a reminder for anybody on the phone with a question, you can hit the pound or #6 to unmute your line. And if anybody else would like to ask a question in the chat room, please do so. All right, so Christine mentions that she works for a financial institute as a product owner.
Okay, so I would expect then, if you're working for a financial institution, that your risk, your legal risk is pretty high and it's continuous. And that certainly, if you work in a financial institution, you are going to be constantly rolling out products, constantly rolling out websites. And so the real argument there would be that you're running a marathon and not a sprint. And so while you may be able to help on a part-time basis or working as a contractor to remediate issues with their website or something specific, that the need for ongoing planning and the need to be able to reduce the costs by having you or having an accessibility professional at the table earlier on in the process more than outweighs the actual cost of their salary. But there are also other particular standards that apply specifically to financial institutions. Financial institutions, for instance, ATMs were among the first devices that had accessibility standards applied to them. And there is it's especially important to prove equal access if you're dealing with financial products.
Okay, we do have a few more questions coming in, and Jim is asking, can you describe an experience you've had where business case for accessibility was most effective and one where it was not effective at all?
I can't really get into specifics in terms of stuff happening internally in the organization. So I think the best way I can describe it is where I've run into the most pushback has been with a specific director who is more in the don't care category, and that particular director was the one that was pushing the hardest for trying to set up a threshold, a pass-fail threshold for what was the minimum amount of effort that it would take to be accessible. It was also particularly challenging because we had already implemented some accessibility remediation before I came on board, and the standards that were set for that were different from the standards that we believe in now. And so being able to change the standards was challenging because this director was accusing us of moving the finish line on him, which I think is a legitimate concern, but not one that really served the company particularly well. Best case scenario would be different directors that have invited me to integrate well with your team. And so we have recurring standing meetings, we feed each other issues, and there's this mutual understanding and respect where I'm trying as little as possible to disrupt their timelines and work as easily as possible within their issue reporting. So I would say that is probably the best sort of scenario, the best sort of experience that I've encountered.
Okay. Jim says thank you. That was helpful. And I do have another question come in from Joshua. Yes, regarding integrating into bug tracking systems, do you think there is a danger that hundreds or thousands of bug reports will lead to piecemeal solutions rather than a more holistic redesign of, say, a shopping cart to make the entire experience accessible?
It's a good question. It actually rolls up to a bigger issue, which is not an accessibility issue, which is at what point do you need to upgrade or replace a piece of a bad piece of software? And it's a little bit hard to determine. I mean, for instance, in some of my blog posts and stuff, I'll compare accessibility issues to toxic waste or pollution. So if it's kind of like finding asbestos in your house or having toxic waste that needs to clean up. So it's almost at what point does your website become that Superfund site that just needs to be buried in the ground or something? So that's a larger decision where you really do have to make a cost-benefit analysis of really what is your potential legal risk and what is the cost of replacement and whether or not that is serving your brand well. But oftentimes the trigger is that that piece of software or that website may be outdated, or the cost of switching to a newer one that's accessible is not that difficult. And so typically it's not the accessibility person that makes that call. They inform whoever the decision maker is. And so really I would try to open a really frank and no BS conversation with that business decision maker in terms of when or what is the right point, what's the tipping point for switching over and implementing a new product. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, these have all been great questions. And again, as a reminder, if you're on the phone, you can hit the pound or hash key and the number 6 to ask the question over the phone. Is anybody else want to have any questions to ask? Maybe, Claudio, do you want to put the slide up again that had your resources? Of course, we'll be making this presentation available.
Sure.
We'll be sending it out, but just while we're up there again, we have some great resources throughout the presentation. It does look like someone is typing, so we'll just have a second here for that question to come through. Okay, the question, looks like we have a couple might be coming in now from Susan. Asked, on the slide that showed the spreadsheet, the cost for accessibility report seemed high. Can you describe such a report?
Susan, I agree. So I can go back to that slide. And again, I'm not the author of the slide. I'm not the author of the person giving the numbers, but I wanted to point out that there is this calculator, this spreadsheet out there that if you do have those numbers, you can plug them in. So one of the biggest expenses that we run into is the cost of running accessibility audits. So if you're working with one of the premier firms and you need to have a manual audit done of your site, you should probably be expecting to spend about $1,200 per page or component that's being reviewed. So the 45K number could easily be the cost of reviewing something like 40 pages. In our cases, would be split up into different business units. But again, if you're asking a middle manager to review 20 key pages of their website, and you're looking at an expense of $25,000 to run that audit, that's a significant chunk of budget, and that can definitely lead to some back and forth and some horse trading in order to make that audit happen. So that can be a real challenge. But one of the things I would strongly recommend to you folks as accessibility professionals is if you can learn to do manual audits where you're testing for keyboard accessibility, if you can learn to handle that on your own, then you're going to complement what you can basically catch with automated testing, say with Wave or an inexpensive tool. So you can, if you get yourself to the point or train yourself to the point where you can run a manual audit with reasonable amount of confidence, it'll take you probably a few months to be able to get yourself up to that point, then you can bring that cost of producing accessibility reports much, much lower. And you can run reporting on more aspects of your digital properties more frequently than if you had to farm it out to a third-party resource. So in our organization too, we look at these manual audits as a final exam. And so doing an in-house mini audit is more like a quiz in the middle of a course. It also changes the dynamic in terms of how you as an accessibility professional work with teams, because you're able to be on their side preparing them for a final exam that's difficult that a third party is conducting.
Okay, I thank you for that, Claudio. And on a side note, actually the author of the spreadsheet, Peter Schilke, is actually the presenter of our February webinar. So we'll have a little more information at the end of this presentation about upcoming webinars. So I thought I'd mention that since we did have some questions around this. I did have one other question come in from Stephanie. Says, asked, do you recommend any tools and where we can find the cost calculator?
It would be the spreadsheet. I mean, and as far as tools and calculating costs, it really is, it's estimating with Excel or Google Sheets that you're working with. For manual testing as well, I've developed a spreadsheet that calculates percentages and scores based on severity and based on whether or not specific tests pass and fail. But when it comes down to a lot of this, Excel can be your best friend. So it pays to know it pretty well.
Absolutely. Okay. I have another question came in from Kevin. Are there specific automatic testing programs that you would recommend?
Okay. It really depends on what you want, and I'm kind of in a tough position because I evaluated a slew of them as part of the beginning of my project, or beginning of my stay here at Royal Caribbean. It really depends on what you want. If you want something that really behaves like analytics and something that has a good API and where it's very, very quantitative, um, SiteImprove is a good option. Other vendors are really good, particularly on the consulting side. But for me, I'm a UX designer, and really the look and the feel and the straightforwardness of the user experience for me was number one. And for me, what I was looking for the most was what looked the most like Google Analytics, or what behaved like New Relic, which is another tool that I work with. Those aren't accessibility testing tools, but that was where I set the bar for the user experience and the interface that I wanted to work with. And I think with the other tools that are out there, we'll get there eventually. And one of the challenges that you have is that New Relic and Google Analytics, I don't believe, are fully accessible. So it's a difficult trade-off as to whether or not you want to be 100% accessible with all of your business graphics and your data visualization, or whether or not you want to follow a well-trod path and a well-known pattern for tools that are not necessarily accessible. So I wouldn't want to be in the position of these vendors right now, trying to make those difficult decisions.
Okay, Kevin said thank you very much. We do still have a few more minutes. If anybody thinks of another question you'd like to add in the chat or chime in on the phone, we'll go ahead and share a few more bits of information with you. I wanted to thank Claudio for the presentation today and kicking off our 2019 Professional Development Webinar Series. It was great to have him here today. And I'd also like to thank our captionist. And just give me a second here. Here we go. So there is a feedback survey that we'd like to ask you to take a few moments to fill out. Give us some feedback about the webinar today. And you can see that link in the screen here. And then we have upcoming webinars, as I mentioned, since we were talking about that spreadsheet in February, at the end of February. We have Tackling a Huge Website with WCAG EM, and that's with Peter Schilke, that was mentioned during Claudio's presentation. And in March, we have Web Accessibility Techniques for React.js and AngularJS. So those registration is open for both of those webinars, and you can find those on our website. And we will be sending out an email either later today or tomorrow with a link to the feedback survey as well as the recording of today's presentation and the presentation deck. You can go to our website to see the more websites that'll be, or more webinars that'll be available in 2009. I'm just checking to see if there was any other questions that came in. All right, everybody said thank you, Claudio. I got a lot of thank yous. Great presentation. Any closing remarks?
No, thank you all. This has been fun. I only wish I could hear you folks and interact a little bit more with you, a little more personally. But thank you so much for attending, and I hope you got something out of this today.
Okay. Thank you again, Claudia. And for anybody on still, you can exit the webinar by just closing out of the Adobe Connect or your browser to log out of the webinar, or hang up the phone. And we hope to see you at future IAAP webinars.